we'll just jump right in if that's okay with everyone. And it's a real pleasure to have everyone here. I just want to let everyone know that we are recording the session, so we can post it online after the fact. So I'll just start by saying welcome everyone to the April APCG online colloquium. Thank you so much for being here with us. Really appreciate it. So we're very pleased to welcome Salma Emmanuel to the April colloquium. She's an assistant lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam, and she's going to be presenting today her paper entitled "The Pervasive Power of Supreme Courts: Evidence from Tanzania." And we're very lucky to welcome with us two discussants. We have Fiona Shamba, who is an assistant professor at William and Mary, and we have Danny Choi, who's an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, both who will provide comments on Salma's paper. So how we're going to do this is I'll give Salma about 5 minutes to just provide some context for the paper, and then we'll jump straight in to the discussing comments. So I'll ask Fiona to go first and give you 10 to 15 minutes to provide comments and questions that you have for Salma. And then Danny, I'll give you as well 10 to 15 minutes. We'll give Salma then a chance to respond and then open it up to audience questions and discussion. So Salma, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alessia. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Salma Emmanuel. I'm an assistant lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam, and I'm happy to be presenting this paper that I have been co-authoring with Dylan and Constantine Manda and a research team at Columbia University on the persuasive power of Supreme Courts, evidence from Tanzania, as Alessia has explained. So just to give an overview of this paper, the paper evaluates the social influence of a recently internationally celebrated ruling in Tanzania Supreme Court that banned early marriage for girls younger than 18 years. So we were lucky to be able to conduct that research with the Columbia research team, which was conducting a survey in rural Tanzania between 2019 and 2020. In October 2019, the Court of Appeal of Tanzania ruled in Rebecca Gyumi versus the Attorney General in Tanzania's Law and Marriage Act, where the court said that the Marriage Act violated girls' constitutional right to non-discrimination by making them eligible for marriage at 15 years, 3 years before boys. So we saw this as an advantage to learn about whether the court rulings influence social views, even in the conservative areas. So in summary, our findings suggest that progressive court rulings can influence social attitudes, but the persuasive power of the court depends on whether and how media communicate them to the general public. So before I continue, I would want to give thanks to and to recognize the contribution of several groups that made this research possible. First, Rebecca Gyumi and her organization, which is called the Msichana Initiative, who have done a lot of great work in raising awareness about early marriage issues in Tanzania. And they've been very helpful to us in the conversations that we've had with them. I also want to thank UZIKWASA, which is one of the great NGOs in Tanga, who has helped us to develop the media reports and have been very wonderful to work with over several years in Tanga region. I would also want to thank an NGO called Uliza, which helped us to transform the audio messages to written messages, and we were able to interpret them and share with them in the paper. Finally, I would also like to thank our research team at IPA, Innovation for Poverty Action. The surveyors had to do a lot of difficult things for this research, and we do think that they did a great job. Finally, I have some few requests to make. We have a lot of questions that we have spoken with UZIKWASA and Msichana Initiative about a follow-up research. So we are very excited to get this opportunity to get feedback from you. Some of the questions that our research team has discussed include what literature should we connect our paper to? We know right now we've been focused on the persuasive influence of courts, but we would also talk more on human rights promotion or early marriage. Second, we would also want to get your opinion on the outcome, where we ask people whether they are willing to record a message about early marriage. This was the first time that we used this outcome measure. So we would want to hear any feedback and suggestions about it. Like, is it a convincing measure also? Third, we would also want to hear if there are any other ways to present the news report that you would recommend if we have the time and resources to do further research. And finally, we had considered adding a section on how the effect of the treatment was different among different groups, but there are a lot of options. So we would want to hear if people have any recommendations for specific heterogeneous treatment effects that they would be interested in that we could look at. I would like to thank everyone who will join us today and looking forward to hearing feedback from you. Back to you, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Salma. That was really incredibly useful. Thank you for highlighting some of the questions that you still have remaining. Fiona, I will just turn it directly over to you and jump into your comments.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I just wanted to start by saying I really enjoy reading this paper. It is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. And I'm very excited to see like more work looking at like public opinion of the courts in especially like East Africa. So this was a really great empirical contribution, I think, to that end. So my comments are sort of organized in the flow of how I read the paper. So that might explain why I'm jumping around from certain topic to certain topic. Okay, so just like in terms of the way that you set up the puzzle, right? So you mentioned at the beginning, the Tanzanian judiciary is among the most trusted in sub-Saharan Africa. And you say that this is largely like because of efforts that happened during the post-colonial era, right? Because the judiciary was starting to actually collaborate with the media. It's actually encouraging judges to disseminate their rulings through radio and television sources. So I started asking myself, like, if publicizing judgments is what makes the judges so trustworthy, historically speaking, why is it still the case that the judiciary is so trusted today if few people are so aware of judgments, right? Because that's kind of like one of the sort of the opening puzzles of your story, right? Like people don't know about these controversial decisions. So if people don't know, that means that the judiciary isn't doing a good job of broadcasting the work that it's been doing. And so you actually say in the same section, a relatively high level of legitimacy does not imply high levels of public awareness about the court's members or activities. So this kind of contradicts the point that you were making above about why the court was legitimate in the first place. Okay, so in terms of the research design, I think that the experiment, it sounds really cool, but I thought the description of it was actually a little bit confusing. And I think you could do a little more to clarify sort of how this was actually rolled out. So my understanding is that the treatment itself was a radio news bulletin. So the survey enumerator is playing this for, a given survey respondent. But then I started getting a little confused when you began discussing this larger field experiment that this treatment was a part of, right? So you talk about these radio dramas. So these are fictional radio programs which are disseminating sort of moralizing messages, right, about early or forced marriages. How do the news bulletins fit into this? Are they sort of like, I don't know, are the bulletins played during the intermission of these radio dramas? I didn't actually understand like the overall setup of the treatment. So you cited some other studies like Green et al. 2021, but if you could do more to clarify what that other study has to do with this one, that would be really helpful. Okay, so moving to the results section. So the results suggest there's already pretty low levels of acceptance of child marriage, right, before you even run the treatment. So you say less than 1 out of 10 respondents said that it was acceptable in the abstract, right, for early childhood marriage to occur. And then acceptance goes up when reasons are provided, like religion or financial hardship. So the opening of the paper, so just as like a small note, the opening of the paper says this is a controversial ruling, but the fact that the baseline acceptance is already pretty low, to what extent is this a controversial outcome? Could you do more to like contextualize how we should interpret that? And furthermore, given the fact that it seems like attitudes towards child marriage aren't moving that much after the intervention, I think the most intriguing finding here that you could further flesh out in the discussion has to do with the likelihood of individuals reporting early childhood marriage, right? So that's an effect that doesn't hold for the community at large, but the fact that it does seem to move at the individual level, that's something I wanted to hear more about. So this got me thinking a lot about like individual beliefs versus communal values, and that's something that you do dwell on a bit in the paper. So you say, our findings suggest that rural Tanzanians think that rulings by the Court of Appeals signal what is morally correct, while many Americans think that rulings by the Supreme Court signal what is socially accepted. So I sat with this sentence for a while because I wasn't actually sure what the difference is between moral correctness and socially acceptable behavior, right? Isn't the latter also a type of moral judgment? So as I was thinking about this, I was wondering, is an alternative explanation for the story that we see here, it's not about moral versus social correctness. Maybe it's about individual versus communal risks of sanction. So individuals might perceive that their personal cost of violating the law is greater than the communal one. So if I, one person, break the law, it's not like the rest of my community is going to be punished for my violation, right? As might have been the case during the colonial era, but that's not what's happening here. So the risk that won't be borne out equally by all members of the community, even if the community doesn't uphold those views in the aggregate. And so the fact that you actually see individuals are more likely to report instances of the violation of this law, it actually might fit this broader story of like individual versus communal values. So I think you could also potentially tie this way of thinking about individual versus community to your findings about speaking out. So the willingness of someone to take a public stand against early childhood marriage on the radio, that's a highly personal public endorsement, speaking out against this. And it's actually internally consistent, at least in my mind, that someone who's more likely to report a crime because of their individual risk of sanction by the state is also less willing to publicly proclaim their support of this law because there's an individual risk of sanction by their local community. So this is assuming that if you're reporting people violating the law, that's like an anonymous process. Okay, one final set of comments, and then I'll hand it over to Danny, who will have like more intelligent things to say. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about this like court and attorney general treatment effect. So the test here is whether court rulings are seen as a proxy for the views of the ruling party. So if courts are perceived as credibly independent of their relationship to the regime, then we should see the effect of the court ruling be positive, even when it includes information about the attorney general. So I'm not actually sure that the treatment is actually capturing this difference, at least the way that it was specified in the paper, because the way that the alternative treatment condition is defined, so the attorney general disagrees with the court ruling, that is actually defining a court and an attorney general as being independent. So I'm not sure if we have enough information to infer from the baseline treatment whether the attorney general like actually agrees or disagrees with the court. So we can't infer, are people perceiving the court as a puppet of the regime, or are they actually receiving it as an autonomous body? So you might be underestimating the effect of the court and the attorney general treatment. But also, I'm not exactly sure how to interpret the result that including information about the attorney general diminishes the effect of the court's ruling, because if the attorney general disagrees with the court, that means the court is more independent. And isn't judicial independence one of the reasons why the judiciary is so trusted in the first place? in the country. So if people think the courts are not just a puppet mouthpiece of the regime, which is wouldn't that mean people are less willing to accept the court's ruling? Why is it that we see people less willing to accept the court's ruling if they see the court as independent, if that makes sense? So can we actually differentiate between what is morally permissible here and what should be legally enforced? Like these again seem like kind of interdependent concepts, if not the same concepts in the first place. So those are my main comments. I mean, overall, I still like really enjoyed reading the paper, but I think there's a lot of rich material here that you can flesh out. And I'll hand it off to Danny.
Thank you so much.
I actually have a few slides. If you can allow me to share the screen, that'd be great. Oh, actually, I can already. Sorry about that. All right, great. Salma, thanks for sharing the paper with us. As is the case with Fiona, like this was such a pleasure to read. I had a lot of fun. So, I originally thought that the data was what you have, and you basically had to figure out different ways to sort of make the most out of the existing data collection. But I think given that you just said that you might be able to do some follow-ups, right? I'll try to fold in some comments that might actually not be super useful for this particular paper per se, but actually help you think about tweaks in the research design moving forward if you were to implement a different project. Okay, so just to give a summary, question was, do decisions or rulings by the Constitutional Court shape public opinion? Salma and co-authors study this in Tanzania, where the Court of Appeal rendered a decision banning marriage for all girls under the age of 18. They do this, they try to answer this question with an experiment embedded in a survey of close to 2,000 rural Tanzanians. And what they find is that information on court rulings increases rejection of early marriage, but that the effects are quite circumscribed in a way because you really sort of see no effects on social norms or perceptions of community attitudes, and that the effects basically attenuate when countervailing narratives presented by another government agent, namely the Attorney General, is actually included as a part of the treatment. So I thought this paper was great, and I'm going to actually take time into say why I thought it was great. I thought and I think I had a conversation with Fiona about this. I think the writing and the prose was just superb. It was a pleasure to read. It was super clearly written, and I think we sort of, as a discipline, don't value this like trait or a characteristic of a paper as much as we should. So I would like to congratulate you guys on that. I also thought it was, as you say, a hugely substantively important sort of thing to study, right? We know that the African courts are playing an increasing role in shaping public policy on contentious and polarizing social issues. And this isn't just a case where you see this in Tanzania. We had cases in Kenya, for example, that where the court actually decided in sort of the non-progressive way, which is to sort of continue criminalizing LGBTQ or homosexuality in Kenya. We had similar decisions in Zambia, and I think there are lots of court cases where African courts are potentially going to be agents for progressive social change rather than sort of simple like passive adjudicators of legal disputes. Oh, Salma disappeared.
Oh no!
Oh, I guess Dylan is here, so
I don't know, but I'll send her a message. This is her moment. Let me.
Yeah, I wonder if it's
should I hold or should I go on?
Maybe
I'm calling her on WhatsApp. Just give me.
Let's just hold for 1 minute. Just thank you, Dan. Yeah, just in case. Hopefully, it's just a connectivity issue or.
Oh, Salma's back.
I can claim no credit for getting her back on, but it does seem like.
Perfect. Thanks, Denny.
So yeah, so I completely agree with their assessment that this is a substantively important topic that warrants study. It's also an important one theoretically as well. It, like, as you said, research on African courts is at a relatively nascent stage, and there's almost no research on how the court affects really public opinion in these countries. So definitely thought that was a very important step. I also love the fact that you were going beyond just individual attitudinal change, and you were at least trying to measure or think about concretely sort of perceptions of social norms, which I think I will try to push you on a little bit later as we sort of move forward. So I thought also just in the empirics, and I think, you know, maybe you should make a bigger deal of this. I thought it was a really creative and innovative approach towards treatment delivery, right? I think a lot of these survey experiments often tend to be survey vignettes. Obviously, there are depending on context, there's like literacy issues, and I think treatment delivery in a radio sort of news clip that you created with, like, you know, collaboration from Pangani FM was great. I really thought building in the treatment condition where there is a counter narrative to the court sort of was really cool because it reflects public discourse and media coverage of social issues. It's like very rare that you see a newspaper article that says the court decided this and where they sort of let that sit. It's often sort of narrated with different opinions about the court and whether people disagree or not, right? So I thought that was really good. I also commend you for the transparency. The study was pre-registered, analysis conducted according to the pre-analysis plan, and you were actually super transparent about what analysis was pre-registered and what was not, right? I think that's sort of like desirable sort of attributes of an experimental paper. Now, I think I'll mention some things I think you might potentially benefit from as you move forward with the paper. And I think Salma already sort of preempted this question about like, what are the heterogeneity, like treatment effects heterogeneity that we should think about? I think, you know, you have, you know, it looks like, I mean, I was working with a little bit sort of limited information about the vastness of the covariates that you collected during the survey, but it, you know, one thing that came to mind was that, you know, I think in a way you frame the paper as if the court was a highly respected, revered institution, and you cite Tanzanian history. But, you know, as Fiona, for example, mentions in her work continuously, like courts are inherently political and politicized institutions, right? So and furthermore, voters often have strong opinions about salient social issues, right? And that sort of, you know, inherently raises concerns about heterogeneity in the treatment effects across different subgroups. So this is sort of like a easy, you know, thing to do, given that you seem to have a fair number of covariates. You might want to think about the moderating effects of partisanship in the Tanzanian context. I don't know what your sample composition looks like, but it might be worth looking into whether there are differences based on partisanship of the respondent, given that we know opposition and incumbent party supporters differ in their trust towards government institutions. You might want to also look at whether, if you have a pre-treatment measure for this, whether, you know, the effects that you observe here are moderated by prior beliefs about early marriage, right? Is it moderated by neighborhood context and the proportion of individuals around them that sort of either are for or against early marriage? And as well, and I briefly mentioned this as well, to think about whether trust in or satisfaction with government institutions also play a role, right? I think one literature that you might be able to look at to sort of brainstorm about potential heterogeneity is, again, going to be very closely related to the source credibility literature. And I think it'll give you some good hints about which voters will consider the court's opinion on early marriage to be important to them and their attitudes, right? So one thing that came to mind also is like, I wanted to know whether the treatment effect was actually concentrated among people with pliable attitudes. So people who are like, I don't really have a strong opinion about early marriage. And since the court weighed in, I'm going to listen to the court, or whether it was actually moving people who had pretty hardened attitudes or like strong attitudes about early marriage to begin with, but because they respect or revere the institution, that they're willing to change their mind, right? And I think that's already something that I would be super interested in looking, because it's sort of easy to think that opinion change happens amongst the people who are sort of undecided. But it might be the case that in some contexts, even given the high sort of respect for judicial institutions, that you might be think that even people with sort of hardened opinions might change their beliefs, right? Second, I wanted to sort of encourage you to present more, not evidence, but information about the experimental sample, right? You already have a good description of the particulars of the sample, but if you wanted to make general claims about the population, which you sort of do in the front end of the paper, I think an explicit comparison between your sample versus, say, a regionally representative sample or a nationally representative sample might be quite informative, right? So to be very specific, it might benefit you to have like a side-by-side tabular presentation of demographic characteristics between your sample and a more representative sample, say the Afrobarometer, for example, right? And that will help user or readers to sort of relate the sample average treatment effects you observe in the study and sort of start thinking carefully about whether and how it may differ from what you expect, the ways in which the population, the broader population that you want to draw inferences to might respond to the treatment, right? So, and in a way, by doing that, I think it does help clarify or impose scope conditions on your findings and actually make a much more sort of careful argumentation about the generalizability of your study. So finally, that's a repetitive slide. So the third issue I think I wanted to bring up was measurement, right? I've been thinking about social norms a lot because some of my projects involve sort of deep thinking about social norms and normative change, and I sort of was a little bit. It gave me pause that what you were measuring through this measure that you sort of claim to be social norms is whether it's actually measuring sort of social norms, right? Is it, furthermore, I say this because in a way, you're basically saying, we've given you information about a court decision. Like, what do you think other people think about this, right? But then the person who has to answer this question has to make inferences about, like, have people heard about it? You said that only a small fraction of people in rural villages had heard about it. So, and it also is compounded by the fact that, like, oh, do they think that the Supreme Court is able to sway public opinion, right? So it's like something that I think warrants a little bit more careful theorization about. I also think that it might be a little bit tricky to, and perhaps a little bit unreasonable to expect things as sticky as social norms to change as a result of one court decision. I think a deeper dive into the literature on social norms, given that you're thinking about another project, might help you think about better measures. And I'm happy to send some papers that have tried to measure social norms in an alternative way. Here you're talking about what others believe is the appropriate type of behavior. And I think there are different conceptions or wordings that you might be able to use that I'm happy to send your way. I also had, thought about the reporting of the violation outcome. There's a part of me that sort of likes that because it's a quasi-behavioral outcome, right? But in a way, it's a very, very difficult test, right? Because reporting is also likely to violate a different type of social norm. So even if I have a really strong tendency to support or reject, early marriage, because there are also social norms about, protecting, people close to you and the, villagers who live near you and you have a relationship with, right? And these are sort of embedded, rooted relationships that are sort of embedded in this like local context, that it's an especially sort of hard thing to do, even if you had strong beliefs about the appropriateness of early marriage, right? And I think maybe if you didn't instead of going this far, sort of thought about appropriate, like you ask questions about appropriateness of punishment or things like that, that isn't necessarily about me actively reporting people or snitching on people, might be sort of the next sort of thing for you to think about. I actually, finally, I'll wrap up in a second. I think you could try to make more use of the textual outcomes. I know you had them record short videos, short audio clips, and you transcribed them, which I thought was great. I think my experience, having run some of these experiments related to social norms, right, is I've actually had a really good sort of set of results just having people sort of explain why they're responding to a particular question in a certain way, right? So instead of having people send a recording to like a politician, say, like just asking them to elaborate on what the thought process was and collecting sort of, instead of like shorter clips, sort of a longer, unabridged version of what they're thinking. I think actually I got a lot of really good results on that for different projects. So something to definitely think about. And you can definitely look at topic modeling or something, supervised or unsupervised machine learning methods to deal with that kind of data. One final sort of very tiny comment, given that the design of this experiment was relatively simple, I think one thing that I was sort of wanting was like a visual presentation rather than a tabular presentation. You're dealing with percentages, which is very, very easy to process for many people, right? So, and I think having like a graphical representation, not coefficients plots, but like just raw difference in means. So, sorry, not difference in means, but raw percentages for each of the conditions, and sort of summarizing the data that way will be particularly effective, given that you don't have some like really complicated clustered or block randomized design here, right? So I think just for presentational purposes, that might be one thing that you want to do. All right, I think I'll stop there and love to sort of talk to you more about how you might take this.
Danny, thank you so much for those comments. Salma, I'll turn it over to you if you would like to respond to any of those comments from Fiona and Danny, and otherwise we can then open it up to the broader discussion.
Thank you so much, Alesha. Thank you so much, Fiona and Danny, for the great questions and contributions. I'm going to answer the questions, but I also invite my team if they would have anything to add. So starting with Fiona, thank you for the great feedback that you have given. I would start with the question that you asked, whether there is an important difference between what is morally correct versus what is socially acceptable. So with this question, I would just like to admit that I don't think I have an answer right now, but this is something that me and my team will think about and have a more discussion on that. But I also like to answer on the question of whether reporting is the most interesting measure, since people already say that they reject the early marriage. in my opinion, I think saying you're rejecting early marriage is one thing, but being able to report it is also another thing. So that's why we wanted to see the willingness to report from these respondents so that we can measure how confident they are in rejecting the early marriage. Also, I would like to answer on the question about the sample, the generalization, whether the rural Tanga that we used in our experiment can be used to generalize the whole results to other parts of Tanzania. I think in my experience, most of the urban areas are already exposed and rejecting early marriage. People are already speaking out. So doing the research in the rural areas, which are considered to be the most conservative areas, would be a proper sample to generalize how this court ruling can influence social attitudes by using the media reports that we used in the experiment. Then the question of measurement of social norms. Is it reasonable to expect social norms to change as a result of only one experiment? Well, I would admit that our research used measured the immediate effects, but we would expect that if we did the research, if we had given them time, maybe the effects would have declined because people get distracted. So other things would have come and probably the effect would have been lesser. But Uzi Kwasta, an NGO we have been working with in Tanga, is now doing larger campaigns on early marriage. So we are expecting to measure the effect, and we hope to have larger effects after we work with them on the larger campaigns that they're conducting right now to see the change in the social attitudes as a result of those large campaigns. The other question was on reporting violates social norms. I don't think I got this. Maybe the question could be repeated so that I could hear it better. But the question of why the attitudes don't change when you introduce the Attorney General treatment effect, that one could have many answers, and I was also hoping to hear that from you. But in my opinion, I would think that in Tanzania, in our culture, people don't, most of them don't like to oppose what the government says. So if we introduce that treatment where the Attorney General appeals against the court, people are more likely to say, if the government is then undecided and not giving me one thing to stand on, then I would rather remain with my own opinion. So I think that is why we don't see a change in when we introduce the Attorney General treatment to the survey. Maybe if Ilan and Constantine have something to add up.
No, Salma, I think you did an amazing job. Congratulations. But maybe we can open it up to larger conversation.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for that great response, Salma, and for those questions. So I would like at this point to open it up to other audience members. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, I will. Dylan.
Yeah, I just want to highlight a point that came up in the discussion, and maybe Salma can speak to it too, because it was one of her kind of first insights. Is Salma, you were the one who talked in the paper, kind of made us focus on whether people think the Attorney General or the court is, if they're important independently, or only because they are, people think that they just represent the ruling party or the ruling government. And I just wanted to hear you talk about what you think is happening there. Do you think that people trust the court because it's this independent court? I think Fiona made the point that maybe we overstated that. Or do you think they just think the court is important because it represents the ruling regime?
Yeah.
Well, that's something that I think also Danny talked about, that if the court, the court might be viewed as a puppet for the government. But in the case of Tanzania, I would say that in some instances, the court is not viewed to be something unique. So that's why even in the experiment, when the Attorney General disagreed, the people were sort of confused, because we don't expect people in rural areas to differentiate between the court and the Attorney General, because most of them tend to view it as one thing. So I think for this case, I think the court is not really something very unique, and that's why there is a change when we introduce the Attorney General treatment.
So I actually want to say, this point, the way you're explaining it now is more clear. And I think like what you just said about the way that this dynamic works in Tanzania, right? It's particular to how people perceive these party dynamics. And I think that that's an important point to be really explicit about in the paper as well, precisely because the default narrative about judicial independence in the literature, and this is Western democratic courts literature, and which also bleeds over into anytime people study courts in the global South, it always assumes that checks and balances, judicial independence, this is how people see a strong and independent court. And I think that these dynamics are really complicated in less perfect democracies or emerging autocracies, whatever you want to call those hybrid regimes. So I think this is a really important theoretical nuance that you're adding here. And I think it could just be more clear in the paper.
Thank you so much.
And maybe I can jump in on.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, if that's okay, because I do have just a couple of questions that I think go off of that, and are really particular about whether you think that your findings are particular to the Tanzanian context. And I think if they are, that's absolutely fine. But I think understanding, the ways in which these findings are generalizable would be helpful. And if you don't think they're generalizable, which is also absolutely fine, just providing a little bit more of that context of, the Tanzanian context and why it is particular to the Tanzanian context, which I think may be rooted in a long history. And I think that in and itself is interesting, because the Tanzanian context is fascinating. And I think as you were talking both about the history and the culture and what people expect, from the courts and how that's mediated by the existing regime, I think all of these play in really interestingly into some of the results that you might be finding. I think providing some of that context, to the reader would be extremely helpful. But I would also love to hear your thoughts about whether this is, these findings are specific to the Tanzanian context. I think that also got into thinking about these questions of morally correct versus socially acceptable, which might, in terms of clarifying that, to me, that felt very particular potentially to the Tanzanian context in the way I read it, but maybe that's as someone who's, coming from a background of doing research in Tanzania and those kind of specificities. So I think there's a lot to unpack there in terms of what is particular to the Tanzanian context and why that would be potentially the case. I also was wondering a little bit, you talked about questions about how many people more generally were aware of court rulings, but I was wondering if you asked questions, prior to these vignettes about whether people were aware of these court rulings, so that you had that information prior to the vignette that you presented, and whether that was having potentially an impact. And I would also love to hear a little bit more about what you think is going on when people were more willing to record audio for the radio versus the DC, which to me, I thought was quite interesting. I know that's relatively small, but again, I think there's something potentially particular here happening for the Tanzanian context and unpacking why that might be, and also potentially asking people, in terms of why they might be willing to record for some contexts versus others. And then I would also love to hear more about Tanga and why Tanga, whether that was just particular. I think, I can understand working with Tangana, working with potentially, specific NGOs, absolutely all great reasons to be doing the research there, but then providing the reader who might not be familiar with the Tanzanian context a little bit of background about Tanga particularly, and how we might expect, I think, as both Danny and Fiona pointed out, how we might expect this to play out in other contexts in Tanzania if Tanga is potentially representative of other rural contexts, for example.
Thank you, Fiona. Sorry, would you please repeat the second question about awareness so that I can hear it properly?
Which one? About awareness?
Aware.
Oh, sorry, yes, sorry, thanks. About wondering whether you asked specifically questions before you gave, the radio vignette of whether people were already aware of the court ruling. So, if you're going to respond and asking before you gave this vignette, if someone knew already, if they were already aware of the court ruling, if they knew about the court ruling prior to, this intervention, prior to you presenting this information to them, because I think that could potentially have a mediating effect if someone was already aware of what was going on, right? So they had prior knowledge of the court ruling. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I just wasn't clear whether those questions had been asked or not. So maybe you did ask that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for the great feedback. I mean, Alesha, I would respond to these questions, but if anyone of my team wants to respond, they're free to add up. So one, regarding the applicability of the research to the Tanzanian context. So in my opinion, I think it depends on the level of trust that the people have on the judicial authority. So for the case of Tanzania, we have seen that the judicial court people trust the judicial court. So the court ruling is more likely to influence the social attitudes and to have social influence in the society. But this is something that me and my research team have been discussing on, and we would love to do a follow-up research and see how it would apply in other contexts or other countries. Regarding the awareness question, where we asked people if they were aware of this court ruling that happened in October 2019, only about 7% of the respondents said that they were aware. But this was only 9 months after the court ruling had happened. So probably if we would have gone after 2 years, a year and a half, there would have been campaigns and a lot of discussions, and maybe most of them could have been aware of the court ruling. Regarding why people were willing to share the message we're not willing to share the message with the local government, but we're willing to share with the local radio. In my opinion, I would think that maybe because we had already introduced the treatment where the Attorney General was appealing against the court, so these people would not again want to go against what the government has said. Remember, I said that it's, in most cases, people in rural areas cannot differentiate between the court and the Attorney General. So when we presented the treatments to them, they would be like, oh, so one part of the government says this, the other one says this, so I remain with my opinion. So we're saying that you're going to share the messages with the district commissioner or the local government was a bit tricky for them they were less likely to accept that, because again, it would be like you're rejecting what the government is saying. And The other one where you said, why Tanga? This is a very good question, and I think we are going to explain it in the paper. But we had other researchers together. We've been working with Uzi Kwasa, and that's why we thought we could also do the research of regarding the court ruling persuasiveness. But this is something that we'll consider so that we explain why Tanga and are able to maybe include also other regions so that we can get a more representative sample. Yeah.
Thank you.
And if I could just add one point, because I had to scramble back to our survey instrument, because your point was so good about making sure we hadn't pre-exposed people to the court ruling. So in the treatment group, we preceded the news thing by asking them, were you aware of this? In the treatment group where they were already going to learn. Whereas in the control group, we asked, were you aware of the ruling after we had asked all the outcome measures later, all in the interest of preventing any bias in that regard. So you're absolutely right to be concerned, and we will absolutely make that clear in the version.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, that's fantastic. Does anyone else have any questions, or Fiona or Danny, are there any kind of further comments or that you have for?
Yeah, so I think, I have a couple of things. One thing, when I said compare your sample to a broader or a different sample, perhaps, I wasn't necessarily thinking that you should be in a position to compare to an urban sample, because I think you're absolutely right. But even within the group of rural people, right? Because this isn't like a representative sample of, I'm not sure if Tanga is like the sort of a, yeah, like a good example, or like what does the sample composition look like? Is it like any other rural community, or is there certain different sort of traits about this sample that you might be able to sort of think about? In terms of one suggestion, as you think about expanding the scope of the paper and perhaps launching new projects, it seems to me that taking sort of a bird's eye view of like court rulings on social issues across Africa, it seems that, in your case, this was a progressive decision, right? That sort of pushed back against the existing sort of thinking on early marriage, right? And the sort of pervasive thinking on early marriage, perhaps, that's rooted in sort of customs. But in many cases, the decision often goes the other way, right? So in contexts where the court ruling actually reinforces existing attitudes, I think might be a good set of cases for you to also consider, right? I think it's all got to do with what sort of like the generalized perception on these issues are, and whether the court decisions either reinforce that understanding or counteract it, right? And so I have a paper with a bunch of co-authors on the court decision in Kenya about LGBT criminalization. And we had a slightly different setting. We had a panel survey, a three-way panel survey. And so once the court decision against LGBT populations were actually like rendered, we actually got absolutely nothing with perspective taking treatments before we actually had some results. But in a way, we think about it as court sort of moderating or circumscribing the effectiveness of social campaigns that are ongoing in many of these countries. But in cases where the court rules in perhaps the predictable manner or the predicted way, I think that also gives you a lot to sort of think about in this context. And I think I'd find that super interesting. If there are additional cases in the Tanzanian context, for example, I would sort of pair that with this case and think about both sides of the coin. Yeah. But again, I thought this paper was wonderful.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Honestly, yeah, this paper is really fantastic. Really enjoyed reading it. It's clear that both Danny and Fiona did as well. And I think I'm really looking forward to future iterations of this paper and, to seeing it also out in publication and to the future work that you're going to be able to do with this. So I would like to encourage you to, stay in touch. I'll send an email out to everyone, and hopefully Danny and Fiona can also send you copies of their comments, which is easier. It can be difficult to take everything in a short session, but I just want to say thank you so much to Fiona and Danny. Thank you so much for taking the time to provide such thoughtful comments. Salma, thank you so much for sharing your paper and for being with us today, and really grateful for your participation in the APCG online colloquium. So thank you all so much. And I look forward to continuing the conversation offline.
Thank you so much, Alesha. I would like to thank everyone, especially Fiona and Danny, for the great comments. Me and my team will work on them and allow me to reach out in case of any questions and feedback.
This was great. It's fun.
Great.
Nice to meet
So
you all.
much, guys. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Salma.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Salma.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Salma, it really was a pleasure. So thank you so much for participating. And yeah, I hope good luck. Congratulations on the PhD. And that's fantastic and so exciting.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Take care.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aziz, for joining. Nice to see you.
Yeah, enjoy the session.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.